and welcome to another edition of the News Review. In this edition, Russia and Ukraine expel diplomats amid rising tensions over Moscow's decision to briefly detain a Ukrainian diplomat. Moscow says the Ukrainian consul in St. Petersburg was detained for reportedly trying to obtain classified information in a meeting with a Russian security agent. Russia said that it will expel a senior diplomat, promoting an immediate pledge of retaliation from Kiev. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry said it has, too, ordered a senior Russian diplomat to leave. Tensions have further escalated over Russia's troop buildup near its borders with Ukraine. Kiev has been battling pro-Russia forces in eastern Ukraine since 2014. Clashes intensified early this year, effectively shredding a ceasefire agreed last July. Now, for more on that, we're joined by Mr. George Zizmuli, Senior Research Fellow of the Global Policy Institute from Budapest, and Ramiro Funes, political analyst and commentator out of Los Angeles. Thank you very much to both of you, gentlemen. Let's begin with Mr. Zizmuli. Now, what do you make of this recent development, and how far do you think this can escalate?
Well, I don't think that this expulsion of diplomats is in itself that significant. I mean, the fact that it's simply a one-to-one expulsion is in some ways a good sign, in that no one is escalating too drastically. So if something very serious was on the cards within the next week or so, then I think there would be a much more serious case of diplomatic expulsions, or closing down the consulate or whatever. So that hasn't happened. But there's no question there is a serious crisis in Ukraine, and unless there is some kind of mutual agreement on the part of the actors involved, it could spiral out of control. Now, to be honest, I think that the crisis has improved somewhat as the week has gone on, because the statements that have come from Washington and from the G7, which has insisted on a solution to the Ukraine crisis on the basis of the Minsk Accords, I think that's a good sign, because it's clear that that the position of the powers that have supported Ukraine is that there can be no attempt to solve the problem in Ukraine using force. It has to be based on negotiations on the Minsk Accords.
Thank you very much. So let's bring in Mr. Ramiro Funes out of Los Angeles. So, Mr. Funes, what do you make of this recent development, and do you believe that this could probably lead to Russia maybe taking away those military hardware from the Ukrainian border, maybe reducing military personnel there?
I think the recent development of clashes between Russia and Ukraine have to be framed in the context of who's in the White House. And who's in the White House right now is Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. And we know that from day one, the Democrats are the wing of US imperialism that are staunchly opposed to Russia. They want war with Russia because the financial forces that control the Democratic Party are the big oil institutions like ExxonMobil, like Chevron, these multinational giants that control the NGOs. They control the oil industrial complex, the NGO industrial complex. And also these are the same forces that under President Barack Obama supported fascists in Ukraine, and especially in the Euromaidan, the color revolution that took out the democratically elected president in 2014, that was backed by the US, so that the Western and EU oil companies can go into Ukraine, stop any trade with Russia, because at the end of the day, we have to follow the money. And this is a competition between the Western oil giants that run the Democratic Party, they run the media, they run the NGOs, who demonize Russia and want any excuse to escalate war. And so this whole time, they're victimizing Ukraine. They're making it seem as if Russia is taking over Crimea when over 95% of Crimeans voted to join the Russian Federation in 2014. And the Ukrainian government has been slaughtering ethnic Russians because they're run by a fascist government that is backed by the EU, the US, and is virulently anti-Russian. And so I think all of this has to be framed within the Democrats wanting to attack Russia. They want a new war against Russia so that they can run the global oil economy.
So, Mr. Funes, how far do you think this could go?
I think we're in very scary times. We're talking about a President Joe Biden who has not only supported invasions in Libya, he has supported coups d'etats against several countries. I'm very concerned that this could escalate into a full-scale conflict with Russia in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian-Russian border. We know that Biden allegedly is pulling troops out of Afghanistan. This timed with more aggression against Russia is concerning because I think the Afghanistan pullout was kind of a PR stunt as a way to brand him as an anti-war president, to now shift his attention back to Russia and Ukraine, to then divide the Eastern hemisphere against each other to maintain U.S. dominance. So I'm very concerned that this could escalate into a full conflict.
So, Mr. Sesmioli, are you as pessimistic as Mr. Funes?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a possibility that something very bad could happen. Because I think Ukraine has pursued a rather reckless policy in moving its forces on the line of contact in Ukraine, and in seemingly they were ready to launch a major military offensive. However, I think Russia, by moving its forces to the border in Ukraine and making clear that any offensive emanating from Kiev would be met by force from Russia, I think that has, cooled heads in Kiev, but more importantly, it's cooled heads in Washington and Brussels. And I think the significant development from last week was the decision by Washington not to send in the warships into the Black Sea. I mean, remember the Biden administration had announced that, they're right behind Ukraine, and they're sending in warships into the Black Sea. Then they changed their minds. In other words, they suddenly realized that if things get out of hand, they could soon be in a shooting war with Russia. So I think by the fact that the Western powers, chiefly the United States, have backed away from trying to resolve the conflict between Kiev and the breakaway regions, trying to resolve it on the basis of force, by the fact that they have backed away from that and are now supporting negotiations on the basis of the Minsk Accords, which is Russia's position, I think things have improved. But you never know. The people who are running Kiev are really crazy, and some of them may well be reckless enough to try to provoke a conflict with Russia in the hope that this might lead to Ukraine being incorporated within NATO, which I think is the goal of a number of people in Kiev and I think of a number of people in Washington. So at the moment, it looks like cooler heads have prevailed, but there's always a danger.
Thank you very much, Mr. George Sesmioli, Senior Research Fellow at the Global Policy Institute out of Budapest, and Mr. Ramiro Funes, political analyst and commentator out of Los Angeles. Thanks to both of you, gentlemen, and thanks to all of our viewers for following this edition of the News Review.